Here we will discuss the anatomy as well as the functions of selected structures of the female reproductive system. And we'll begin with a brief overview. First we'll examine the ovaries, which are the female gonads that produce the ova, which are the eggs. They also produce hormones like estrogens, such as estradiol and progesterone. And similar to the male reproductive system, there's a series of ducts that have very specific functions for the female reproductive system. These ducts include the uterine tubes, which are also called the fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. And the vagina is a muscular canal that serves as the entrance to the reproductive tract, but it also serves as the exit from the uterus during menses, that is during the menstrual cycle when the uterine lining is shed, as well as serving as the exit from the uterus during childbirth. So this diagram shows the development of both the male and female external reproductive structures, and it highlights the fact that they both develop from the same common embryonic tissues. So prior to 8 weeks of fetal development, the fetus is in what we call a sexually indifferent stage. That is, the external genitalia have not yet begun to develop. And it's only the sex chromosomes that determine the sex of the fetus. So females, of course, have 2 X chromosomes, while males have an X and a Y chromosome. So prior to 8 weeks of development, really the only thing that distinguishes male from female is the genetic makeup rather than the physical makeup, as the physical external reproductive structures have not yet begun to develop. There are 3 external structures that we will focus on: the genital tubercle, the urethral fold, and the labioscrotal swelling. The sexually indifferent stage is shown at the top center of the diagram, and if the hormone testosterone is present, we follow the left side of the diagram, we see that the genital tubercle will develop into the glans penis, the urethral folds will become the spongy urethra that is contained within the penis, and the labioscrotal swelling will become the scrotum. However, if the hormone testosterone is absent and we follow the right side of the diagram, we see that the genital tubercle becomes the clitoris, the urethral folds become the labia minora, which surround the opening, the immediate opening to the vaginal canal, and the labioscrotal swelling become the labia majora. So in this diagram, we're going to examine the ovaries, the uterine tube, the uterus, the cervix, as well as the vagina. The ovaries are the paired gonads, as we mentioned earlier, that are found on each side of the uterus. The uterine tubes will carry ovulated ova or eggs from the ovaries toward the uterus. And the uterine tubes are the site where fertilization typically occurs. And fertilized or unfertilized ova will be moved toward the uterus by ciliated cells that line the walls of the uterine tubes. The uterus will be the site of implantation and fetal development, and we will see that the inner lining of the uterus, which is called the endometrium, is what will build up with blood vessels and glands in order to make a structure that's called the placenta, which is the connection between the mother and the developing fetus. If a fertilized ova is not implanted, that is, if there's an ova present but it is not fertilized, the endometrium of the uterus is going to be shed monthly during the menstrual flow and the menstrual cycle in premenopausal women. The cervix is situated between the uterus and the vagina and serves to provide a passageway for sperm from the vagina to the uterus and as a passageway for the shedding of the endometrium during the menstrual cycle or as part of the birth canal during childbirth. The ovaries are the almond-shaped paired gonads that function in producing the ova, as mentioned earlier, from structures called ovarian follicles. And those follicles also produce hormones such as estradiol and progesterone from the endocrine cells that those follicles contain. They are connected to the uterus by the ovarian ligaments, which we're going to see in the next diagram here. So as we saw previously, the ovaries are paired and found on each side of the uterus, and here we also see the ovarian ligament extending from the medial part of each ovary and anchoring it to the outer wall of the uterus. So structures that are within the ovaries, called the follicles, produce ova or eggs in addition to producing hormones. A spike in luteinizing hormone, which is called the LH surge, from the anterior pituitary gland is going to trigger ovulation from a dominant or a mature follicle that is in the ovary. And then after the ovum has been ovulated from that follicle will become a structure that's called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum functions as an endocrine gland. It'll produce estrogens like estradiol, as well as producing progesterone. And progesterone is going to help promote the maintenance of the endometrium in the uterus, as well as the initial buildup of the endometrium in the uterus, which we'll see a little bit later on. And it's this buildup of the endometrium in the uterus that's going to prepare the uterus for implantation by a fertilized ovum or a fertilized egg. So one kind of interesting configuration is that the uterine tubes do not directly make contact with the ovaries. Instead, the ovulated ova are pulled into the uterine tubes by these small finger-like structures that are called fimbriae, which wave and move fluid as well as ovulated eggs into the uterine tubes. And this is why it is possible for ectopic pregnancies to occur, because eggs can be fertilized and implant in areas of the pelvis other than the uterus. However, what we realistically see is that most ectopic pregnancies actually occur in the uterine tubes when a fertilized ovum implants itself into the wall of the uterine tubes. I believe this number is somewhere around 90% of ectopic pregnancies occur in the uterine tubes. The uterine tubes have walls that are made out of smooth muscle and are lined with cilia to help move the ovulated ova towards the uterus. So as mentioned previously, the uterine tubes are the typical site of fertilization, because ova that are viable to be fertilized are viable within 24 hours after ovulation. And the journey of the ovum from the ovary towards the uterus through the uterine tube takes anywhere from 3 to 4 days. So that means that ova are only viable while they're moving through the uterine tubes. By the time they actually make it to the uterus, they're no longer viable to be fertilized. And also recall that there are substances called prostaglandins that are in the semen that help to promote reverse peristalsis in the uterus. That is, it promotes these reverse contractions in the uterus, which helps to move sperm up through the uterus towards the uterine tubes and helps to kind of speed up that microscopic movement of the sperm and help aid in fertilization. So from the previous diagram, the broad ligament that we'll see in a moment supports the uterus, the uterine tubes, as well as the outer parts of the vagina to the body wall. So it's not important to be able to identify all of the regions of the broad ligament, just be able to identify the broad ligament itself in a diagram such as this. Moving on to the uterus, we see that the uterus is a hollow pear-shaped organ whose walls are composed mostly of thick layers of smooth muscle that function in uterine contractions. Although there's another important layer to the uterus, that's the uterine lining, and it's this inner lining of the uterus that is the typical site of fetal nourishment as well as development, as this lining is where the placenta will develop when a fertilized ovum implants into it. So here we have a lateral view of the female reproductive tract and system, showing the thickness of the smooth muscle that's in the middle wall of the uterus, which, as we'll see in a little bit, is called the myometrium. We also see in this diagram the round ligament, which supports the uterus to the anterior part of the body wall. So returning momentarily to the anterior view, we find the fundus of the uterus, which is the rounded superior aspect of the uterus that's located near the uterine tubes. We also see the body of the uterus, which makes up the bulk of the uterus and is situated between the fundus and a narrow region called the isthmus. And finally we have the isthmus, which is the narrow region of the uterus that becomes the cervix. The uterine wall has several different tissue types as well as important functions associated with those different tissue types. The inner lining of the uterus is referred to as the endometrium, and it is lined with a simple columnar epithelium as well as a connective tissue. It's called the lamina propria. And the lamina propria is what contains blood vessels that are going to build up in preparation for the development of the placenta, which is the maternal fetal blood connection, so that nutrients and waste can be exchanged between maternal and fetal blood supplies. Implantation of a fertilized ova will occur in the endometrium. And next we have the thickest layer of the uterine wall, which is the myometrium. As its name implies, myo, it contains layers of smooth muscle that function in producing uterine contractions. So in this diagram we can see both the endometrium and the myometrium, as well as a thin outer layer that's referred to as the perimetrium, which simply helps to connect the uterus to nearby ligaments and nearby structures. So returning back to the endometrium of the uterus, we see the lamina propria, which houses the blood vessels and the glands that function in preparation for nourishing an implanted embryo. The functional layer is shed and rebuilt during the uterine or during the menstrual cycle. Meanwhile, the uterine glands that are seen within this functional layer are going to secrete nutrients, enzymes, as well as other substances that are needed by both the fetal and embryonic membranes like the amnion and the chorion. And so these will help to maintain the internal environment of the uterus during child development or during fetal development. So looking briefly at the menstrual cycle, we're going to identify three phases shown along the bottom of this diagram here. The menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, as well as the secretory phase. Now the menstrual phase corresponds to the shedding of the endometrium and corresponds to the menstrual flow as well. The beginning of flow is set as the start of the cycle because it is the most easily observable. Next we have the proliferative phase, which occurs next and helps to promote the buildup of both the blood vessels and the glands that we saw in the functional layer of the endometrium. Last, we see the secretory phase that functions to maintain the thickened uterine lining or the thickened endometrium in preparation for an implantation of a fertilized ovum. The secretory phase corresponds with ovulation. The spike in estrogens during the end of the proliferative phase are going to correspond to the surge in both luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, which is going to signal ovulation of an ovum from an ovarian follicle. The increases in progesterone after ovulation from a follicle from the corpus luteum will help to maintain the uterine lining during the secretory phase. And it's these levels, these elevated levels of progesterone, that allow the secretory phase to continue. And then as you can see towards the right side of this diagram, when those progesterone levels begin to drop, that is going to correspond to the shedding of the endometrium and the start of the menstrual flow, which will then help to begin the cycle again at the menstrual phase. So here we can summarize the major sources as well as the effects of the hormones of the female reproductive system. First, we have estrogens, which are mostly in the form of a hormone called estradiol. Primarily estradiol and estrogens come from the follicles as well as the corpus luteum of the ovaries. And their primary stimulus for release from the ovaries are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, both from the anterior pituitary gland. And in general, estrogens will stimulate the growth and maturation of the reproductive organs as well as the breasts during puberty, in addition to functioning in maintaining their adult functions. It promotes a function called oogenesis, which is the formation of ova within the follicles, as well as ovulation, in addition to supporting the growth of the uterus and the maintenance of the mammary glands during pregnancy. So next we have the hormone progesterone, which primarily comes from the corpus luteum of the ovaries. So recall that the corpus luteum is the structure that exists after an ovum has been ovulated from a follicle. So the remainder, or the remnants of that follicle, is the corpus luteum. The main stimulus for the release of progesterone is the surge of luteinizing hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary. And progesterone helps to maintain the secretory phase of the uterine cycle in preparation for implantation of a fertilized ovum. And progesterone also stimulates the beating of the cilia in the uterine tubes. And during pregnancy, progesterone helps to prevent the myometrium from contracting, so it helps to prevent uterine contractions. And before I move on here, I will highlight again that both estrogens as well as progesterone are steroid hormones, so they're both cholesterol-based, lipid-based hormones. So other effects that estrogens have is that it promotes the growth of the skeleton, much like testosterone does, but it does promote anatomical growth in the pelvis of females to accommodate childbirth, and estrogens also inhibit bone reabsorption. So this is why postmenopausal women often develop osteoporosis, because the drop in estrogens promote bone reabsorption as well as skeleton breakdown. Estrogens also function in much the same way as aldosterone, because estrogens help to promote sodium reabsorption and therefore water reabsorption from the filtrate that is going through the kidney tubules back into the bloodstream. So this promotes both sodium and water retention, which is usually associated with the bloating during the menstrual cycle and during pregnancy. So our final region of the uterus that we're going to examine is called the cervix, which functions as the outlet of the uterus into the vagina. So it contains the cervical canal, and it has essentially two ends or two openings that allow passage through the cervical canal: the internal os and the external os. The internal os faces toward the uterus, while the external os faces toward the vagina. So in our last view of this particular diagram, we see the cervix that is situated between the vagina and the uterus, keeping in mind that the cervix is actually the last region of the uterus. The internal os opens from the uterus to the cervical canal, and then the cervical canal continues to the external os, which opens towards the vagina. In our final topic, we will discuss the vagina, which, as we mentioned earlier, is a muscular canal that functions as the entrance to the reproductive tract because it receives semen from the male during sexual intercourse, and it also functions as the exit from the uterus during the shedding of the uterus, during the menstrual cycle, or during childbirth. So there is sometimes a thin partial membrane that is called the hymen that covers the opening of the vagina. It is only a partial membrane if it is present at all, because it must permit the shedding of the endometrium of the uterus during the menstrual flow. It's never a fully intact membrane because if it were, it would prevent menstrual flow. We also see that there are beneficial bacteria that inhabit the vagina, and in doing so, they produce secretions of lactic acid, which helps to lower the pH of the vagina and prevent harmful bacteria from occupying that space.